Silence descended on that courtroom the moment Marcus Thompson reached into the brown paper bag. It was not the kind of silence you command with a gavel. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room realizing it had misjudged everything. It wasn't that eating during a hearing was the issue. Courtrooms are full of minor disruptions. It was what the bag contained that stopped everyone cold. A single granola bar and a juice box, the kind with cartoon characters printed on the side, packed for his 6-year-old daughter. In that instant, the sterile, intimidating atmosphere of the court evaporated, replaced by a raw, human reality that no law book could prepare you for. 37 years on this bench had given me a dangerous amount of confidence. I had reached a point where I believed I had witnessed every variation of human circumstance a courtroom could produce. I thought I knew what guilty looked like, and I thought I knew what desperate looked like. But what this man was about to lay before me that morning made me examine something I had long taken for granted, whether justice and the law are always pointing in the same direction. Marcus stood before me on a Tuesday morning in April. He held a citation in his hand, a piece of paper that represented a total of $5,000 in accumulated fines. $5,000. To the city, it was a ledger entry, an expected result of rigorous enforcement. To Marcus, it was a mountain he could never climb. He was 32 years old, but he carried the weight of someone twice that age. The shirt he wore had a small tear near the collar, a tear that someone had taken the time to stitch carefully back together. His shoes were worn down to the soles, yet they had been polished before he walked through those heavy double doors. Everything about his appearance communicated two things at once: exhaustion and dignity, occupying the same body, refusing to give way to each other. The prosecutor, efficient and entirely detached, presented the case with a practiced cadence. Marcus had accumulated 17 citations across a 6-month stretch for operating a food cart without the required permits at various locations throughout the city. Each violation was $300. He had paid none of them. The total had grown through compounding penalties into the $5,000 figure now before the court, and the city was here to collect. I looked at Marcus directly, trying to see past the numbers. "Mr. Thompson, do you understand the charges before you?" "Yes, Your Honor." The answer was firm. No hedging, no attempt at deflection, just a straightforward acknowledgement of reality. That kind of directness is rarer in this room than people might imagine. Most defendants arrive prepared to fight, to explain, or to justify their existence. Marcus simply stood there, accepting responsibility for something I had not yet fully understood. We were just beginning to peel back the layers. "Mr. Thompson, these permits are not a significant financial barrier," I pressed, trying to find the logic in the chaos. "A street vendor license in this city runs $250 annually. What prevented you from obtaining one?" He shifted his weight, his eyes momentarily darting away before locking back onto mine. "I tried, Your Honor, 3 separate times." The prosecutor stepped in, a thin smile on his face, sensing an easy point to score. "Your Honor, the defendant's applications were denied on zoning grounds." He continued applying for locations that fall outside areas, approved for street vending. I raised my hand, silencing the prosecutor. Something about that explanation was not sitting right. It was too neat, too bureaucratic. "Mr. Thompson, if you were aware those locations were not approved, why did you continue setting up in them?" Marcus took a breath, a shallow, ragged thing. "Because those are the only locations accessible to me during those hours, Your Honor." Something important had just entered the room. It was the shift from a legal case to a life story. "Explain what you mean by that." Marcus straightened, his posture rigid. "Your Honor, I am working 3 jobs. My overnight shift as a security guard at Memorial Hospital runs from 11:00 at night until 7:00 the morning. After that, I drive for a rideshare company from 7:30 until 2:00 the afternoon. The cart runs from 2:30 until 6:00 the evening. The locations the city has flagged as non-compliant happen to be the only ones situated between where my rideshare shift ends and where I need to be to collect my children from school at 6:15. 3 jobs." Those 2 words settled into the courtroom air, heavy and undeniable. I looked at him, really looked at him. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was a structural necessity. He wasn't breaking the law to defy the system. He was breaking the law to navigate a life that was already broken. "You have children, Mr. Thompson?" 3, Your Honor. "Maya is 8, Jacob is 6, and Daniel just turned 4. And then he mentioned their mother. His jaw moved almost imperceptibly before he answered. She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. The room produced that particular quality of silence I have come to recognize over decades on this bench. It is the sound of assumptions falling apart quietly all at once. The prosecutor, who had been ready to list statutes, suddenly found his notes less interesting than the floorboards. I looked back at the citation record. 17 violations across 6 months. By rough calculation, that averages to roughly 1 every 10 days. The sheer math of his misery was dizzying. Mr. Thompson, given that frequency, why not simply stop operating in those locations? Why keep putting yourself in a position to be cited? Because I need that third income, Your Honor. Without it, rent becomes impossible. It wasn't an excuse. It was an audit of his existence. He was a man drowning, and he was being fined for the way he splashed. The prosecutor cleared his throat, the sound sharp and jarring in the heavy air. Your Honor, while the defendant's personal circumstances are difficult, the legal standard is clear. These regulations serve the purposes of public safety and fair commerce. Creating exceptions based on hardship would open the door to every defendant presenting similar claims. He wasn't wrong on the legal question. That was precisely what made the moment so difficult to navigate. My path to this bench was not built on limiting my interest to what was technically legal. It was built on caring about what was right. And occasionally those two things stand on opposite sides of the room, staring each other down with very different things to say. I looked at the prosecutor, then back at Marcus. The disparity was nauseating. Mr. Thompson, take me through your day, I said, my voice steady. Start from the moment you wake up. He looked uncertain. It was as though the question might be a test of some kind or a trap. He hesitated. What time do you get up? Following the end of my security shift, I get approximately 3 hours of sleep. So, I am up around 10:00 the morning. From there, I get the children organized for school. Maya is old enough to help with the younger two, but breakfast still needs to be made. Lunch is packed, homework checked. I have them at school by 11:45, and then I begin the rideshare shift. I leaned forward, observing his hands. They were trembling, just a fraction. When do you eat lunch, Mr. Thompson? The question landed differently than he expected. It landed differently than the prosecutor expected too, but I ask questions for reasons, always. I generally do not, Your Honor. There are snacks in the car. Show me what you brought with you today. Marcus paused, then reached into his jacket and withdrew that same brown paper bag. He opened it with the careful, almost reverent movements of someone slightly embarrassed by the meager contents. 1 granola bar, 1 juice box. That is your lunch for today? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. It was supposed to be Maya's after-school snack. I did not manage to grab anything else this morning. I looked at that juice box for a long moment. This man was operating on 3 hours of sleep, managing 3 jobs, raising 3 children without a partner, and the item he had brought to eat while awaiting his hearing in a courtroom was his daughter's afternoon snack, set aside because he had been too occupied with everyone else's needs to attend to his own. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. He could see where things were moving. But what no one in that room was aware of yet was a detail I had noticed in Marcus's file, a detail so small that it had escaped everyone else's attention. That detail was about to become the center of everything. I picked up the citation record again. It was time to pull the thread. Mr. Hernandez, I said, addressing the prosecutor, my voice low but carrying the weight of the moment. You are correct that the legal framework here is straightforward. These regulations were created for legitimate purposes: public safety, traffic flow, fair commerce. But I want you to work through something with me. If this court suspends Mr. Thompson's ability to work, what is the outcome for those 3 children? His expression tightened. He knew exactly where the math was heading. Your Honor, I understand the complexity, but the principle of selective enforcement based on individual sympathy creates serious problems for the integrity of the regulatory system. I am not discussing sympathy, counselor. I am discussing consequences. The city currently spends approximately $6,000 per month per child in foster care. For 3 children, that is $18,000 monthly. Across 1 year, that represents $216,000 in public funds. And that projection assumes all 3 children are placed together, which the statistical reality of the foster care system makes unlikely. Factor in trauma therapy, additional caseworker hours, and the legal costs of custody proceedings. The fiscal exposure grows substantially from there. I leaned forward, the wood of the bench feeling solid under my hands. Mr. Thompson owes $6,800. Even setting aside the fact that payment is currently impossible for him, that amount flows once to the city. If his license is suspended instead, the city begins an ongoing monthly expenditure that dwarfs the fine amount within the first few weeks. From a purely fiscal standpoint, which outcome serves the public interest? The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. He was perceptive enough to recognize the position the argument had placed him in. There was no response available that didn't make the city appear either indifferent to the consequences of its own policies or fiscally careless with public funds. But I was not finished. Mr. Thompson, I turned back to him, my voice softening just enough to show him I had seen past the defendant title. I have reviewed your complete file, not the citation record alone. Before your wife's illness, you were working as a loan officer. Annual salary of $78,000. Following her death, you took 3 months away to manage your grief and care for your children. When you returned, your position was filled. You have been sustaining these 3 jobs for 18 months in an attempt to rebuild financial stability. Marcus's eyes filled, the wall of dignity finally showing a crack. No one in that process had paused long enough to read the full story. They had seen a man accumulating violations and treated that as the complete picture. Your Honor, he said, his voice barely a whisper, I understand that I broke the law. I am not here asking to be treated as an exception. I just need a path forward that does not cost my children their home. That was the moment I arrived at a decision that would define my time on this bench. Mr. Hernandez, I said, addressing the prosecutor, my voice low but carrying the weight of the moment. You are correct that the legal framework here is straightforward. These regulations were created for legitimate purposes, public safety, traffic flow, fair commerce. But I want you to work through something with me. If this court suspends Mr. Thompson's ability to work, what is the outcome for those 3 children? His expression tightened. He knew exactly where the math was heading. Your Honor, I understand the complexity, but the principle of selective enforcement based on individual sympathy creates serious problems for the integrity of the regulatory system. I am not discussing sympathy, counselor. I am discussing consequences, I retorted. The city currently spends approximately $6,000 per month per child in foster care. For 3 children, that is $18,000 monthly. Across 1 year, that represents $216,000 in public funds. And that projection assumes all 3 children are placed together, which the statistical reality of the foster care system makes unlikely. Factor in trauma therapy, additional caseworker hours, and the legal costs of custody proceedings. The fiscal exposure grows substantially from there. I leaned forward, the wood of the bench feeling solid under my hands. Mr. Thompson owes $6,800. Even setting aside the fact that payment is currently impossible for him, that amount flows once to the city. If his license is suspended instead, the city begins an ongoing monthly expenditure that dwarfs the fine amount within the first few weeks. From a purely fiscal standpoint, which outcome serves the public interest? The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. He was perceptive enough to recognize the position the argument had placed him in. There was no response available that didn't make the city appear either indifferent to the consequences of its own policies or fiscally careless with public funds. I turned back to Marcus, who was watching us with a mixture of terror and hope. Mr. Thompson, I have reviewed your complete file, not the citation record alone. Before your wife's illness, you were working as a loan officer, annual salary of $78,000. Following her death, you took 3 months away to manage your grief and care for your children. When you returned, your position was filled. You have been sustaining these 3 jobs for 18 months in an attempt to rebuild financial stability. You are a man with marketable skills, Marcus, not a man who belongs on the street. Your Honor, he said, his voice raw, I understand that I broke the law. I am not here asking to be treated as an exception. I just need a path forward that does not cost my children their home. That was the pivot point. The moment where a judge stops being a referee and starts being a gatekeeper for a better outcome. I had the power to destroy him, or the power to demand he build himself back up. I chose the latter. That was the moment I arrived at a decision that subsequently appeared in the local news, generated both strong support and pointed criticism, and permanently altered the way I thought about what sentencing is actually for. I looked at the prosecutor, then back to Marcus, who was holding his breath, waiting for the gavel to fall on his life. Here is what is going to happen, I said, my voice cutting through the stale air of the courtroom. I am consolidating all 17 citations into a single case. The total obligation is $6,800. You are going to pay it in full." Marcus's expression fell. He had been hoping for a miracle, and a $6,800 debt is still a debt. He opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to explain that it was impossible, but I raised my hand. "You are going to satisfy $5,000 of that total through 200 hours of community service, valued at $25 per hour. The remaining $1,800 will be paid in monthly installments of $50 over 3 years. No interest will accrue. That is your path forward." The prosecutor rose, his face flushed with irritation. "Your Honor, community service is not a recognized sentencing option in commercial driving violation cases under the applicable statute." I didn't even look at him. "Judicial discretion in sentencing exists for reasons, Counselor. I am exercising it. If you have a problem with my interpretation of the statute, you may appeal. But in this room, on this day, this is the order." I turned back to Marcus, whose hands were now gripped tightly against the defense table. "Your community service hours will be completed on weekends. The assignment is renovation work at the community center in your neighborhood. The center has work that needs to be done. You have hours that need to be completed. Your children may accompany you. There is a supervised program for kids running at the same time, so they will be safe, and they will be fed." I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto his. "Furthermore, the license suspension is stayed pending your completion of the community service obligation. You may continue operating commercially, but listen to me very carefully, Mr. Thompson. This is not a gift, this is a chance. A single missed payment, a single missed community service session, or a single additional citation will trigger the full suspension immediately and without further hearing. Do you understand those terms completely?" Marcus nodded, his throat working hard as the tears he had been containing finally spilled over. "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. I will not disappoint you." "Do not thank me yet," I said, my tone as firm as iron. 200 hours of physical work are ahead of you. And Mr. Thompson, remember this. Your children are observing how you respond to this. They aren't looking at your bank account, they are looking at your spine. Show them what it looks like to get back up and do what needs to be done. That is the only lesson they need to learn from this." "I will, Your Honor," he whispered. After Marcus had left the room, the prosecutor approached the bench, still bristling. "Your Honor, with respect, the sentence you just imposed creates a template that defendants across this city will attempt to invoke in every future traffic matter." "No, Counselor," I said, beginning to sort my papers. "What I created was a solution that serves justice more effectively than rigid procedural compliance would have. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. Walk me through who benefits if we suspend that man's license today. Not the city, not his children, not society in any measurable way. The only outcome that pure rule enforcement produces in this case is the satisfaction of having applied a rule. That is not justice. That is institutional procedure wearing the appearance of principle." The prosecutor left without continuing the argument. He was a smart man, and he knew when a point had been landed. But what he didn't know, and what he would never see, was the chain reaction that had just been set in motion. The prosecutor left, his professional veneer still intact, but he was unaware of the quiet work that had already begun behind the scenes. What he didn't know was that while he was busy arguing the merits of procedural compliance, I had already made 3 calls during the lunch recess. My chambers were not just a place for judgment. They were a hub for the kind of practical intervention that saves families. The first call was to the director of the local community center. Using funds from the courthouse discretionary budget, a fund often overlooked but vital for these precise interventions, I had arranged for lunch to be provided to Marcus and his children on every Saturday they came to work. It was a simple adjustment, a small, tangible lifeline, but I knew that a man cannot build a future on an empty stomach and a juice box. The second call went to a colleague who directed a job placement program for individuals re-entering professional employment. Marcus's background as a loan officer was not a liability, it was a dormant asset. I knew of 2 financial institutions actively recruiting qualified candidates, and I intended to bridge the gap between his current exhaustion and his previous potential. The third call was to my own insurance contact. I needed a complete, precise understanding of the legal and financial implications of Marcus's specific situation. What I learned from that conversation reinforced that I had reached the right decision, one that would stand up to scrutiny and, more importantly, withstand the test of time. 3 weeks later, My clerk placed a manila envelope on my desk. The return address was Marcus Thompson's. Inside was a handwritten note on paper torn from a spiral notebook, a stark, humble contrast to the formal filings I usually handled. Your Honor, the letter read, I wanted you to know that I have been invited to interview at First National Bank for a loan officer position. The interview is scheduled for next Tuesday. My children helped me select a tie at the thrift store. Whatever the outcome, I wanted to express my gratitude for giving me the opportunity to remain in my children's lives while I address my mistakes. I read that letter 3 times. Then, I placed it in the drawer in my desk where I keep the things that remind me why this work matters. It wasn't just a status update. It was evidence that human beings are capable of rising if you just provide the structure for them to stand. Justice is not always about what is written in the statute books. Sometimes, it is about recognizing the point where the law stops and the human being begins. The story did not end when Marcus left my courtroom. In the years that followed, that single decision proved that one well-considered act creates consequences that travel further than anyone sitting in that room could have anticipated. The community center director called me 2 months after Marcus completed his service. Following the success of his renovation project, 7 other residents from the neighborhood had approached the center, asking if they could volunteer for similar work. They had heard about Marcus, not the man who broke the law, but the man who rebuilt a community space, and they wanted to contribute in the same way. The center suddenly had more volunteers than it could deploy. I convened a meeting that included the city prosecutor, the public defender's office, and neighborhood representatives. Together, we developed what became the Restorative Justice Traffic Program. It wasn't a free pass. It was a rigorous alternative. We excluded repeat offenders and those who posed a genuine danger, like DUI or reckless driving cases. But for people like Marcus, desperate, drowning in circumstance, we offered a structured path. In its first year, 63 people participated. The city's projected savings in foster care and social services costs came to an estimated $1.2 million. But the figure that mattered most to me personally was this: 60. One of those 63 participants kept their licenses. 61 families remained intact. 61 people held onto their employment, their housing, and the stability that made everything else possible. Marcus Thompson became something none of us had imagined when he first walked through my doors. He became a mentor. When new participants entered the program, the director would introduce them to Marcus. He didn't preach. He just showed them his life, his promotion to shift supervisor, his move to a safer neighborhood, and the fact that he was finally sleeping more than 4 hours a night. He showed them that a mistake does not determine who you are. The way you respond to it does. Let me address directly something that comes up every time I tell this story: the question of whether this represents an absence of accountability. Marcus did not avoid accountability. He completed 200 hours of physical labor. He repaid every dollar. He completed parenting classes and financial counseling. When measured against the actual work involved, his accountability was more substantial than a simple license suspension would have ever required. The traditional path would have cost him his housing and his children. The restorative path cost him his sweat, but it saved his soul. 3 years later, Marcus called me again, not because he was obligated to, but because he wanted to share a win. Your Honor, he said, Emma told me recently that she wants to become a judge. She said that judges help people fix their lives, rather than simply punishing them for having made them worse. That single observation from a child is the reason I have remained on this bench for 4 decades. Not for the salary, not for the authority, but for the occasional opportunity to watch someone rebuild their life when given genuine support, rather than punishment designed only to satisfy a procedural obligation. I gave him the same answer I will give you now. I did nothing extraordinary. I listened. I looked at the complete picture rather than the citation summary alone. And I chose the path that served everyone's interests, including the city's and society's. That is not a radical position. It is a practical one. Justice that is functioning correctly asks a different set of questions. Not how do we cause this person to suffer in proportion to what they did, but how do we address the harm that occurred and reduce the probability of it occurring again? Most people, when given a real and structured opportunity to repair their situation, will take it seriously. You just have to be willing to look past the file and see the person holding it.